I mean, most uranium right now comes out of Russia. Thank Clintons for that. The American and Western production of uranium is like, it was just demolished. And so that's changing. They want to try and source uranium locally. It just takes a long time to get there. There's currently way more uranium being consumed than there is being produced. Um, Uranium is, obviously it fuels nuclear power production, and that is the only form of energy production that is both dense enough, clean enough, and safe enough. And has the scaling capacity to produce the energy that the world needs going forward for decades. There is no, on all of those metrics, no other energy production comes close. And if you think it's not clean, if you think it's not green, if you think it's not safe, if you think it's not dense enough in terms of energy, it's like, I'm like, the reality is you've gotten your facts about uranium or nuclear from The Simpsons. It's just not based in reality. Anybody who does like an hour of research into like the truth about nuclear energy realizes, oh my gosh, like this is insane. And so much so that I think that there's probably a behind the scenes effort from like oil over the last like 40 years, because nuclear is the only thing that can really displace it. And a big behind the scenes push to try and get it shut down. But the tide is actually changing. And so politically, we're seeing a move. They're starting to subsidize it or move to subsidize it. We're seeing sentiment shift from individuals just over the last couple of years. Favorability towards nuclear energy has shifted from like 50% up to above 70% just in the last couple of years. And that's both Democrats and Republicans. So we're seeing a big shift take place as people learn the reality, learn the facts, and the fact that it's necessary. I think all those things, I'm very bullish on uranium.
Yeah, and the fact that the fossil fuel industry could be behind some of this negative propaganda when it comes to uranium, that's very real. That's actually documented. You guys, I had an interview with Chris Kiefer the other day, and we talked about this stuff. The coal industry back in the 60s actually pushed the government to unsubsidize the nuclear power industry. This is back in the 60s, not the 80s, not the 90s, not this past decade, but all the way back before your nuclear power even had much of a foothold in the United States. So coal industry back in the 60s actually pushed the government to unsubsidize the nuclear. That's a very real proposition there.
And on top of that, look at the money that they pour into positioning themselves and posing as like, hey, we like wind and we like solar. Well, why would oil and gas companies like wind and solar? Because the
Intermittent.
wind is not always there
Yep.
and the sun's not always there. And what do you need when those unreliable sources of energy are not producing? You need to go
Base
back
load.
to fossil fuels.
Yep.
So yeah, it's something that I'm very excited to see, because I think the future holds a lot more nuclear than the past.
Yeah, yeah. To kind of take it back to my interview with Chris the other day, he just came back from COP 28, and he saw a completely different mood this year versus, let's say, 2 years ago.
Mm.
There's been a huge sea change. There's even a pretty aggressive commitment for tripling nuclear adoption by 2050. He's a big proponent for nuclear energy, and even he thinks that's a little too aggressive. So the world is kind of getting in line when it comes to sobering up and realizing all this wind and solar just isn't going to cut it. And
Mhm.
so, you can't really you can't really hold the energy that you gather from these sources, let's say from the summer to the wintertime. There just isn't enough battery capacity and so forth to actually do that. So I like the fact that you highlighted the importance of nuclear power there. I want to take it back to gold, though. You
Sure.
mentioned that gold is the other yellow metal, right? Uh, you mentioned that gold kind of sniffs out inflation ahead of its time. It did so
Yeah.
back in early 2020. It made an all-time high before we started seeing CPI reads of 9% a year later. We're starting to see some movement and traction in gold now. It's been consistently above $2,000. A couple weeks ago, it even made an all-time high, although it has been acting kind of schizo lately. We did see a 2150 rise and we came back down, broke down below 2000, and now we're sitting at around the mid 2000 level. So what's been going on with gold? Is gold getting ready for a big run up because it's anticipating what you're kind of describing here, or is it something else?
Yeah, I would say so. The if you look at the day-to-day movement in gold, most that's what most people do who are invested in gold, and that's why most people get discouraged. Um, it's even those big moves, like the big 40% move that it made until August of 2021, that took a while for that move to happen. And it was consolidating for years before that. So these moves, they take a long time. Like technically speaking, you can look at it like, the bigger the move, the more like energy has to be, like a spring. You have to squeeze that spring and then release it. And so if it takes 2 years for that consolidation to take place, it's going to it's not going to be like, hey, we touched an all-time high in the middle of one trading day. It came back down. Therefore, it's all over. Like the manipulators won. It's like, no, that's not how it works. It's you have to see some big movements when we're dealing with these time frames. And touch, just a note on the manipulation. I know a lot of precious metals investors believe that 100% the gold market is controlled. And the reality is to the extent any market faces manipulation, the more upside potential it has when that manipulation inevitably breaks, and it is inevitable. So a couple places that we can look at as an illustration of this. Remember GameStop? The most heavily shorted stock there was, had over 100% of its outstanding shares shorted, which is not illegal. There's a very easy explanation for how that happens. What happened to it? It exploded. It went through the stratosphere because the only way to short something is to borrow it and then sell it. How do you close out that trade? You have to buy it back. So every one of those manipulative positions has to be eventually closed out. And when it's closed out, it's the opposite trade from before. And so I hope there's a lot of manipulation happening. What's another example of this? Tesla. I don't remember the exact years, 2018, I think. Most heavily shorted stock. What happened soon after? It, 10x, 20x or something. As all those shorts have to get closed out, as they face their losses, they get squeezed out. An example before that, gold. What was the price of gold from 1945 through 1971? $35 per ounce. Why is that? Because it was the most heavily controlled, manipulated market there ever has been. It was a peg, a price peg. And so what were they doing? Printing a lot more dollars. That means that price that was legally enforced was not the true value. Guess what happens? It breaks. That's why we left the gold standard, because everybody was redeeming their dollars for gold. And Fort Knox was 2 weeks away from getting drained of all its gold. So Nixon said, no, you guys can't have the gold that we promised you. We're going to keep it all. You can keep your paper dollars. That's what happened. And what did the price of gold do after that once it was released from the peg? It skyrocketed into the stratosphere until it reached what the true market value was. And so to the extent that anything does face manipulation, eventually that manipulation has to break and you realize the true market value. And if that's happening, it simply just gives you the ability to purchase more of it at a price that is by definition under its true value. And so I hope there's manipulation happening because it allows me to buy more gold until that manipulation breaks. But intraday spoofing, little things here and there, yes, those cause short-term price changes. in my opinion, those don't do anything to the long-term value being reflected in market prices. And so, yeah, I know there's stuff going on. I know that people just got arrested from Chase. I know that there's, shenanigans that take place. I understand there are derivatives markets, but at the end of the day, any manipulation eventually fails.